So since it's first Sunday of Lent, we are starting a new series. The series is all throughout Lent, and the series is based off of a book by a man named Father Walter Cizek. It's called "He Leadeth Me." So this book is really influential in my life. It's a story of this man, Father Walter Cizek, who was an American priest. He was actually the son of Polish immigrants. He became an American priest, and at one point he became a Jesuit, and at one point he acknowledged this call to be a missionary to Russia. Long story short, we'll talk about this over the course of today and the next few weeks. But when he was in Russia, he was almost immediately arrested and accused of being a Vatican spy. He was in solitary confinement for 5 years and then was in a Soviet gulag for 15 years. And then, they thought he was dead. It was this whole dramatic story. And so he has this book, He Leadeth Me. Now, this is the second book talking about this life. The first book was called With God in Russia. And it's one of those situations where in the book, With God in Russia, it talks about all the details of what happened. And it's kind of this adventure. It's kind of this story of like, oh my gosh, how did a person live through this? But Father Cizek said that this book, He Leadeth Me, is the book he always wanted to write. Because, while the details are important and that the facts of what happened are important, he said, this is like the spiritual, this is what God had done in the midst of all this. And so this is, I would say this, and I don't want to oversell the book, but this is probably the most significant book I've ever read, after the Bible, I've ever read in my entire life. And why? The reason why is because I had read a bunch of books on spiritual life. I'd read a bunch of books about saints. I had never read a book that said, okay, this is how God's grace took an ordinary guy and made him into a saint. Usually we get stories of saints and they're all kind of like plaster statue saints, where they're holy card saints, or they're like, all you hear about the amazing things they did in their lives. But this book, He Leadeth Me, is the story of, again, an ordinary guy from Allentown, Pennsylvania, the Diocese of Allentown, who God made into a saint. And so the book is called He Leadeth Me, and I was trying to figure out over the course of like the months leading up to this series of what are we going to call this? Because I was like, we need a creative name, and then I thought, you know what, we're just going to call it He Leadeth Me because that's the title of the book. Also, I don't like the title of the book, except I was praying with it. I was actually brought it before the Lord, and I was like, because it's kind of thou dost out that leadeth, kind of thing. Why is it called He Leadeth Me? And the answer really, and not just He leads me, or He led me, or He's leading me, is because He Leadeth Me means this. It means God led me, and He was leading me. It means God leads me, and He is leading me. It's this passive and present, or it's past and present. It's this passive and active term that God has led Father Walter Cizek, and God was leading Father Walter Cizek. He leads him, he is leading him. The crazy thing about this book, though, is that God did not lead Father Walter in the way that he expected to be led. Because as he unpacks in this book, there are so many things that he expected his life to be like that did not turn out like his life. And this is what we're going to start with. Because Father Walter Cizek, like a lot of us, when he started this new chapter in his life, when he had this conversion, he had great expectations. He had these massive expectations for his life, and maybe these are the same kind of expectations that you and I have as we begin this Lent. Because I think that whenever we start something new, and we're gonna, okay, here's this Lent, I'm gonna do X, Y, and Z. I'm gonna for the next 40 days, I'm gonna pray like this, I'm gonna give like this, I'm gonna live like that. And we have these expectations of here's what's gonna happen. Here's what that's gonna be like. And I would invite us all, when it comes to Lent and when it comes to life, to be careful of expectations. To be wary of great expectations. Why? Because I believe this, and I don't want to say I believe with my whole heart, but I believe with half of my heart at least. I believe that expectations are a killer of joy. Again, we can't get rid of expectations. We have them still. But I believe that in so many ways, expectations are a killer of joy. They are a thief of peace, and they even rob us of the presence of God. Here's what I mean. How many times have you gotten into a situation, and it's what it is. Here's the reality of life. And you're like, but it isn't what I expected it to be. And so I have less joy now. Or you were looking forward to something, you had expectation of it, and you get there, and you're like, the reality is not what I had expected it to be, and so now I don't have any peace. Or I expected Lent would be just full of God's grace and full of God's presence and full of all these things going on, and the reality was different. And it's actually robbed me of God's presence. I think so often in our lives, expectation is a killer of joy, it is a thief of peace, it robs us of God. Because we get to this place, And we think, we have this saying, like, I didn't think it would be like this. Like, I thought things would be different. And they're not. And we run up against reality. And we have a choice to make. When we run up against reality, we have a choice to make. Am I going to avoid reality, or am I going to accept reality? I think this even goes back to the gospel today. In the gospel, you have Jesus. Here's Mark's gospel, and it says that we know who Jesus is. Like, just imagine you didn't know who Jesus was. Here's Jesus, the Son of God, eternally God from all eternity. And he becomes one of us. Now, how would you and I expect Jesus to come to this earth? Well, he would come as a ruler. He'd come as a politician. He'd come as someone who's famous. He'd come as someone who's a warrior. He'd come as a king. And so that last part is true. He came as a king. But did he come as a king in the way that anyone expected? He's a king born into poverty. He's a king who grew up in obscurity. In fact, even in the gospel today, he's a king. We know this, that he's baptized in the Jordan River. And Mark doesn't describe this, but in the other gospels it says how the Holy Spirit came upon him, anointed him essentially. Then that's why we call him the anointed one, the Messiah, the Christ. He is the king. So what would the king do next? Well, the king would, go to a throne. The king would overthrow the political powers. The king would do something else. That's what we expect. What happened? The Holy Spirit drove him, the king, the Son of God, into the desert to do what? To fast, to pray, and to be tempted by Satan. That's not what I expect. And I imagine that if we were Jesus, if I was Jesus, I would be a little bit disappointed. Because reality of life as the king will be very different than my expectation of life as a king. Now, I don't imagine Jesus was disappointed because, again, he's connected to reality at all times. But this is what life is. This is what Lent is like. This is what Father Chizek's life was like. So, as I mentioned, he's the son of two Polish immigrants. He was born 10 years after they came to the United States. Again, in the Diocese of Allentown in Shenandoah, in Pennsylvania. And at one point, and when he's described as a kid as being basically a hooligan, that he claimed that he skipped more school than he actually went to school. At one point, he described himself as a tough, like kind of he was a bully, and he acknowledged that he was a bully. His father at one point was so frustrated with Walter that he actually took him down to the police station and tried to convince the police to send him off to juvenile detention, right? To send him to reform school because he's just like, I don't know what to do with this kid. Like he's not a good kid. And then out of nowhere, a couple years later, out of nowhere, in junior high school, he decided, I want to be a priest, which so shocked not only his friends, his family, his mom and dad were just blown away by this. But after his mom recovered, she said, okay, Walter, you're going to go to seminary, study to be a priest. But she said this, she said, if you're going to be a priest, make sure you're a good one. So he said yes to seminary. And he goes off to seminary. And he read the lives of the saints. And the guy described, like the saints, they fasted, they prayed. So that's what he did. Walter, in high school, at times there was hours in the chapel, and he would wait till after hours. Then he'd sneak into the chapel. He still had that hooligan in him. He read saints who fasted. And so one year in high school, he went the whole year without eating meat. This is before veganism was a thing. One Lent, he actually only ate bread and water the entire Lent. Didn't tell the spiritual director because, they would get in his way. Because he was like, no, I'm saying yes to being a saint. I'm saying yes to being great. I'm saying yes to he had these great expectations for himself. And if the saints did this, then that's what I'm going to do. And later on, he heard that the Jesuits were like really tough, that they're really, really educated, that they were kind of like the front line of missionaries, front line of priests. And so he got on a train once. And he just basically got to the Jesuit headquarters in northeast United States. And he said he stayed there until the guy in charge of the seminary accepted him. He refused to leave, convinced the guy to take him in. And it was one of those kind of situations where he's like, I say yes to the seminary, I'm saying yes to the Jesuits. At one point, Pope Pius XI wrote a letter to all people in all men seminary. And the Pope described how there was a great need for missionaries in Russia. And Father Walter describes, he says, as I was a seminarian, he was a second year novitiate and of his schooling to be a Jesuit. And he said, as that letter from Pope Pius XI was read, he said something was just burning in his heart, and he realized, hey, this is God's voice. This is exactly what God is calling me to do. I'm going to say yes to this call from the Pope. I'm going to say yes to this call to serve the people in Russia. So he did. He got actually sent off to Rome to study at this Russian seminary called the Rusicum, where he learned Russian and he learned how to say Mass in the Eastern Rite, this whole kind of thing. But it cost him so much. Again, he had said yes to seminary, he said yes to the Jesuits, said yes to being a missionary in Russia, said yes to being shipped off to Rome to go to school. But while he was there, things weren't what he expected. Well, for one, he was incredibly lonely. He was so homesick. He missed his siblings. He missed his mom and dad. In fact, while he was studying in Rome, his father died, and he couldn't afford to fly back to the United States to go to his funeral. In fact, when Father Chisek was finally ordained, I think in 1937, 1938, none of his family could afford to fly to Rome for his ordination. So there was this expectation of greatness, but then this disappointment. So his consolation was, but I'm going to go to Russia. He gets ordained, and then finally, after 3 years, they're like, okay, you're going to go to Russia, but actually, the Holy Father said, no one can go to Russia right now. And so he experiences this real significant disappointment when his expectation, I'm going to serve in Russia, everything he planned for, I'm saying yes to serving in Russia, he was told that it would be impossible for him to serve in Russia. The story goes on, kind of interesting. He was sent then to Poland. And so he's like, well, this is close to Russia. And then pretty soon, Poland was invaded by Russia. And so he was basically, I'm in Russia. So he got on a train and he went to this lumber camp with this other priest. He said, finally, here I am. I'm finally in the place where I thought I wanted to be. I'm finally in the place that I've always dreamed about. And it wasn't what he expected. And this reality came close to crushing him. In fact, he said this. He said that he got to this lumber camp to do work with this other priest, but he found that the people they had come to serve, they had been so infected by communist ideals and by this atheist thought that no one wanted to talk about God. No one wanted to talk about faith. No one wanted to talk. And also they were afraid. They were afraid that if they actually did talk about God, if they did talk about faith, that the Communist Party would come crashing down on them. And so Chisek says this. He says, we were so disappointed. He has this realization that no one wanted to talk to us. We couldn't even live as priests. Couldn't even identify ourselves as priests. He said disappointment grew. He said disappointment gradually gave way to a feeling of disillusionment and depression. There were even times, he said, when I took pity on myself and thought harshly about my fellow workers. I had given up so much. I had sacrificed so much, risked so much in order to bring Christ to them, and they would not even talk to me about this. They wouldn't even talk to me about God. And he goes on to say, he said, at other times I felt humiliated. I'd come to serve and I could not serve because no one would listen to me. He said, we had entered upon what we thought was a great missionary endeavor, full of zeal and enthusiasm, only to come smack up against reality. Things were not at all as we had envisioned them. They weren't what they expected, right? And we were not at all equipped to face things as we found them. So much for our hopes, so much for our expectations, our dreams, our convictions, and above all, our enthusiasms. And he had this incredible temptation. The temptation was, let's just leave. The temptation, he said, he and the other priest kept saying, like, let's just go back to Poland. Let's maybe even, who knows, go back to the United States. This is not what we expected. Reality is nothing like we wanted it to be. Reality is nothing like we expected. And again, this is the case for all of us. In fact, he says this. He says, though our situation may have been somewhat unique, the temptation itself was not. And this is the key for every one of us. This is why this Lent, this series, this life is all about what happens, in so many ways, what happens when reality runs up against our expectations. He says it's the same temptation faced by everyone who's followed a call and found that the realities of life were nothing like their expectations they had at the first flush of his vision and his enthusiasms. So what do we do? This is the question. When we run up against reality, in the midst of expectations, we have two options. We can either avoid reality or we can accept reality. That's what he presents to us. And we can avoid reality, just like Father Chisek. He says, we were so depressed, we were so disillusioned, we were so overwhelmed and crushed by reality that we wanted to run. That's what we do. We get into a situation that is not like I expected, and I want to run, or I want to ignore it, I want to medicate it. I want to reject it. And we just say things like that. We say, I wish it was different. I didn't think it would be like this. I wish it was different. In fact, Father Chisek says the exact things. He said, he recorded the thoughts going through his head and the things he said to God. Here's what he said. He said, It's the temptation to say, this life is not what I thought it would be. How many of us have ever said that? This life is not what I thought it would be. This is not what I bargained for. It's not at all what I wanted either. He goes on to say, if I had known it would be like this, I would never have made this choice. I would never have made this promise. In his prayer, he said, you must forgive me, God, but I want to go back. You cannot hold me to a promise made in ignorance. You can't expect me to keep a covenant based on faith without any previous knowledge of the true facts of life. It's not fair. I never thought it would be like this. I simply cannot stand it, and I will not stay. I will not serve. This is the honest prayer that went through the heart and through the mind of Father Cizek. This is the honest prayer that he actually said. This is the honest prayer that so many of us have. So whether you're in the priesthood, whether you're a missionary, maybe you're just doing life, or married. You know, a little while ago I did this marriage conference. And there was, I don't know, 800 couples, something like that, maybe 400 couples, so, double that people. And at one point, most of them had been married for quite a few times, quite a long, many years. And at one point, I just invited them to look at each other. And as they're looking at each other here, again, years after that wedding day, they just went through this exercise of saying some words to each other, or just realizing some things about each other. And one of the things I invited them to realize is, if you remember your wedding day, and if you can picture that, there are so many things that you didn't know back then. There's so many things that you couldn't have known back then. So many things you couldn't have known on your wedding day what you were going to end up saying yes to. Like there's no way you could know the highs you were going to say yes to. No ways you could have known the lows that were going to say yes to. You had no idea the ways that you would fail your spouse. And there's no way of knowing the ways that they would fail you. Really, on your wedding day, there's no real way of knowing what in sickness really means. On your wedding day, there's no way of really knowing what for worse really indicates. But here they are. And just like Father Cizek, just like every single one of us, we have this challenge, right? The expectation versus the reality. What do? Do we avoid the reality? Do we run away? Do we reject it? Do we ignore it? Do we medicate it? Or do we accept reality? Now, this is the key. The key when our expectations run up against reality is we can avoid it or we can accept it. What does it mean to accept reality? Basically, it just means to acknowledge the truth. And sometimes the truth is, this is really, really tough. Sometimes acceptance is simply a willingness to face reality. Now, keep this in mind. Acceptance is not the same thing as approval, but it's simply a willingness to walk in truth. Like, to acknowledge that this is how things actually are. And then acceptance is to say yes to reality, even to harsh reality. Those married couples that I pointed out to them that you had no idea what you were saying yes to. But you did know one thing. There is no way you could know what you were saying yes to, but you did know who you were saying yes to. And that's the critical piece. Father Cizek, his whole life, as he's in Russia, and he had to put aside his expectations and face and embrace reality, everything changed. But here's the thing, it didn't happen right away. What happened was he had to keep praying. In the midst of this disillusionment, in the midst of this pain, in the midst of being crushed by reality, he and his brother priest, they just kept saying Mass. He and his brother priest, they just kept working every day. They kept saying their prayers every day. And he said this, he says this, he says, and then one day, both of us together, it dawned on us. God granted us the grace to see this solution to our dilemma, the answer to our temptation. Remember, the temptation is, things have not worked out like we expected. Reality is harder. Let's run. He says, it was the grace, quite simply, this is the grace, to look at our situation from his viewpoint rather than ours. It was the grace not to judge our efforts by human standards or what we ourselves wanted or what we expected to happen, but rather according to God's design. It was the grace to understand that our dilemma and our temptation was of our own making and existed in our own minds. It did not and could not coincide with the real world ordained by God and governed ultimately by His will. They realized, wait, we expected one thing, we were given something else. And I can resent that, I can reject that, I can avoid that, or I can accept it. I can reject my expectations, and I can embrace reality. And he says, we would have understood much earlier that our sole purpose at this lumber camp, and he said our sole purpose of living is one thing. The sole purpose of living is to do the will of God. And not the will of God as we expected it, not the will of God as we wished it would be, but rather the will of God that God has envisioned for us and revealed to us each day in reality. And that's what he said. He said the answer to be able to reject expectations and embrace reality, he said, gave them freedom. When they realized, he said that these things, this 24 hours of this day were his will. And we had to learn to recognize his will in the reality of the situation and act accordingly. Because what's the price? If I don't actually learn how to recognize God's will in the reality of our situations, I'm going to end up missing on God. And this is the last thing. That reality didn't make life any easier. They still had to labor. They still had to strive to share the gospel. They still had to make their way through Russia. I mean, Father Chizek's solitary confinement was still in the future. His working in the gulags was still in the future. But in this moment, he was able to lay aside his expectations and embrace reality. And that meant he was also able to embrace God. I mean, think about this. In the gospel, Jesus, he's the king, as we said. And what does he do? He goes into the wilderness. After 40 days, he comes out and begins to proclaim, the kingdom of God is at hand. Now, here's one of the problems. Those people who heard that the king was here and his kingdom was at hand were expecting a different kind of king and expecting a different kind of kingdom. And so what happened? They ended up missing it. Many of them ended up missing him. God was in their midst, but he wasn't what they expected. And so they avoided him. God is in your midst. God is in my midst. God is in the midst of us in the realities of daily life. And if we say, but it's not how I expected this Lent would go. It's not how I expected this life would go. It's not what I said yes to. I didn't say yes to these things. We're going to miss it. Not only going to miss out on God's will, we're going to miss out on God. But if we're willing to put aside our expectations of what things might look like, about what it might feel like, what life might be like, to lay down those great expectations and say, no, I reject my expectations, I embrace reality, then we'll be free. Then we will be free to simply accept reality as his will. To say yes, not just to the circumstances, but to say yes to him. Because at the beginning of each day, at the beginning of this season of Lent, at any point in my life, I can't know. I can't know what I'm saying yes to. But with Jesus,